Genius, monster, or a child god trapped in a mortal world, forever yearning for an innocence that was stolen from him before he ever truly knew it? The story of Michael Jackson is not a biography. It is a modern myth, a cautionary tale of a boy who flew too close to the sun of fame, his wings of innocence meticulously crafted from sequins and vinyl, melting away in the brutal, unforgiving glare of a billion watching eyes. He was our Peter Pan, the eternal boy who wouldn't grow up. But his profound tragedy was that he was a Peter Pan trapped in a world of vicious, calculating adults, a fantasy figure slowly and systematically devoured by a harsh, unyielding reality. To understand this labyrinthine figure, we have no choice but to begin on the night of May 16th, 1983. The Pasadena Civic Auditorium is electric, buzzing with the history of a musical empire. The event is Motown 25, a televised celebration of the sound that changed America. The Jackson 5, the label's last great superstars, have just finished a joyful, nostalgic medley of their classic hits. The crowd is roaring, basking in the warmth of memory. But then, a shift. The brothers exit the stage, their smiles broad, waving to the adoring audience, and one figure remains. He stands alone, bathed in a solitary, shimmering spotlight, a stark silhouette against the vast darkness. He is no longer the cherubic, afro-clad boy from Gary, Indiana. He is something else entirely. A chrysalis emerged, an alien figure of impossible grace and coiled, nervous energy. Dressed in a black sequin jacket that drinks the light, a silver shirt, and black high-water pants that reveal a universe of sparkling socks. He places a black fedora on his head. He pulls the brim low, a deliberate act of concealment that casts his face in an enigmatic, alluring shadow. The entire auditorium holds its collective breath. The air crackles with an anticipation so thick it feels physical. Then the iconic stalking, predatory bass line of Billie Jean begins to pulse through the room, a sound that is both primal and futuristic. For the next 4.5 minutes, the known world stops. This is not a performance. It is an ascension, a coronation, a paradigm shift. Every movement is precise, electric, a fusion of a panther's liquid grace and a staccato robotic perfection that seems inhuman. He is a live wire of pure, unadulterated, channeled talent. Then halfway through the song, as the bridge gives way to the instrumental break, he does it. For a few impossible, logic-defying seconds, he appears to break the laws of physics itself, gliding backwards with an eerie smoothness, as if the stage beneath him has turned to ice. As if he is walking on the very surface of the moonwalk. The crowd doesn't just cheer, they detonate. It is a moment of pure collective secular ecstasy, a shared witness to a miracle. In that single, electrifying instant, the boy from the Jackson 5 dies forever, and the king of pop is born, a global icon forged in light, sequins, and a singular, breathtaking genius. It was the moment he became the most famous, most mesmerizing entertainer on planet Earth. But this was only the first step in a lifelong, tragic pattern. That same move, that impossible backward glide, would become the recurring motif of his entire existence. A moonwalk in reverse during his 2005 trial, a slow, agonizing slide backward into the depths of public humiliation. And finally, a last, silent moonwalk in 2009, a final, peaceful glide backward into an eternal, dreamless sleep. His story is one of relentless forward momentum in fame and a constant, desperate retreat in spirit. Michael Jackson didn't just moonwalk on stage. He moonwalked through life itself, forever gliding backwards with all his might and all his fortune into a childhood he could never, ever reach. The origin of that pain, the primal wound that would fester for a lifetime and shape every note he said, every dance step he took, and every desperate, bizarre choice he made, lies in a small, cramped, 2-bedroom house at 2300 Jackson Street, Gary, Indiana. Gary in the 1950s and 60s was not a place of dreams. It was a city forged in fire and steel, a landscape of smokestacks, union halls, and brutal pragmatism. It was a place where you worked hard, kept your head down, and hoped for a life of modest comfort, not global stardom. It was in this world of grim, industrial realities that Joseph Jackson, a crane operator at the U.S. steel mill by day and a musician with his own thwarted ambitions by night, ruled his growing family with an iron will and, often, an iron fist. Joe was a man forged in the hardships of the Great Depression and the systemic soul-crushing racism of the American South. He was a man who had seen his own dreams of musical stardom wither and die, and he was determined, with a terrifying, almost monomaniacal focus, that his children would not suffer the same fate. He saw in his extraordinarily talented sons and daughters not just a source of fatherly pride, but a one-in-a-billion golden ticket out of a life of grueling, anonymous labor and societal disrespect. His ambition for them was titanic, but his methods were unyieldingly brutal. A relentless campaign of physical and psychological warfare disguised as paternal discipline. The childhood of Michael Jackson and his siblings was not a childhood at all. It was a grueling, full-time, unpaid job from which there was no vacation, no sick days, and no escape. While other children in the neighborhood were playing tag in the streets or attending birthday parties, the Jackson children were inside, locked in endless marathon rehearsals, drilling dance steps and complex harmonies until they were perfect, and then drilling them again and again and again. The tiny living room of their small house was not a place of rest or play. It was a studio, a boot camp, a crucible of talent and terror. And Joe was its unforgiving, omnipresent drill sergeant. He would sit in a chair, often with a belt in his hand, his presence a constant looming threat that sucked the very air out of the room. A missed step, a flawed note, a moment of childish distraction, a glance out the window. Any of these could, and often did, result in a whipping. Michael, the youngest, most sensitive, and most prodigiously talented of the boys, was a frequent target. He would later speak of Joe's cruelty not with adult anger, but with the undiminished, wide-eyed terror of a small child, a trauma that decades of global fame and unimaginable wealth could not erase or even soothe. He recalled being held upside down by one leg while his father beat him mercilessly with a strap. He recalled being thrown against a wall with such force it left him breathless. The physical abuse was horrific, a constant, sharp pain, but the psychological abuse was perhaps even more insidious, a slow-acting poison that reshaped his very sense of self. Joe would relentlessly mock Michael's appearance, ridiculing the size of his nose, a feature he inherited from Joe's side of the family, calling him Big Nose. These casual, cruel taunts planted the deep seeds of body dysmorphia and self-loathing that would later bloom into a series of tragic, transformative surgical alterations. In Joe's world, love was not a currency. He rarely, if ever, told his son he loved him. Affection was a weakness, performance was everything. This relentless regimen of fear and perfectionism had two profound, life-altering effects. First, undeniably, it worked. It transformed 9 talented children into a polished, professional, unstoppable musical force, the Jackson 5. Their talent, honed and sharpened by fear, was simply undeniable. Second, it systematically and violently stole Michael's childhood. He never had a real friend over to play. He never joined a sports team. He was never allowed the simple, defining luxury of being an ordinary, unknown, and imperfect child. His entire youth was a performance, lived on stages, in recording studios, and under the watchful, terrifying gaze of his father. This theft of his childhood became the central, organizing trauma of his entire existence. Every subsequent, seemingly bizarre action, the construction of Neverland Ranch with its private amusement park and zoo, the deep, often controversial friendships with young children, The carefully cultivated Peter Pan persona was a desperate, fantastically expensive, and ultimately doomed attempt to buy back, to rebuild, to relive the innocence that had been so violently ripped away from him. The stage for the young Michael was not a place of pure joy and self-expression in the way we might imagine. It was a deeply paradoxical space. It was the site of his most intense labor and his deepest fears, but it was also a sanctuary, his only escape. The roar of the crowd was a wave of unconditional love and affirmation that he never received from his father. The applause was a temporary, addictive balm for the constant, gnawing terror. As the Jackson 5 were signed to Motown and shot to global stardom, the boy was celebrated and adored by millions, but the child inside was being systematically erased, replaced by a perfectly rehearsed, endlessly charming, and profoundly, achingly lonely product. Was the stage a platform that launched him to unparalleled greatness? Or was it simply a more glamorous, more brightly lit prison than the one he had so desperately escaped back home in Gary? The late 1970s marked the beginning of a quiet, seismic revolution within the Jackson family empire. The Jackson 5, now rebranded as the Jacksons after a contentious split from Motown Records, were still a successful act, but the cultural landscape was changing, shifting under their feet. Disco was burning up the charts, and the bubblegum soul that had made them famous was beginning to feel dated, a relic of a more innocent time. For Michael, now a young man in his late teens and early 20s, this period was one of profound, suffocating artistic and personal frustration. He was no longer a child prodigy content to sing the songs given to him. He was a voracious student of music, a burgeoning, obsessive songwriter with a mind overflowing with complex rhythms, soaring melodies, and a kaleidoscopic vision for a sound that was entirely his own. The creative constraints of the family band, and by extension the still controlling, ever-present hand of his father, Joseph, felt like a creative straitjacket. He yearned for independence, not just as a man, but as an artist seeking his own voice. One of the most courageous and symbolic acts of this silent rebellion was the decision to finally fire his father as his manager. Imagine the scene. A sterile, tense boardroom. Michael, soft-spoken but with an unyielding resolve in his eyes, informing the man who had both created and terrorized him his entire life that his services were no longer required. The disbelief and volcanic rage in Joe's eyes met a quiet, terrifying certainty in his youngest son, a certainty forged in years of silent suffering. It was the moment he broke the chains, an act both terrifying and liberating, thrusting him into a world where his destiny was, for the very first time, his own to command. This yearning culminated in his first true solo effort as an adult, the 1979 masterpiece Off the Wall. This was not just an album, it was a declaration of independence, a sonic manifesto of liberation. To helm the project, Michael made the most important creative choice of his career. He partnered with the legendary producer Quincy Jones, whom he had met on the set of the film The Wiz. In Quincy, Michael found what he never had in his own father. A nurturing, collaborative mentor who saw him not as a product to be controlled, but as a co-creator, a genius to be unleashed. Their partnership was electric, a perfect fusion of Quincy's sophisticated orchestral jazz and funk sensibilities with Michael's raw, intuitive pop genius. The studio environment was a sanctuary, a laboratory, a playground. It was the absolute antithesis of the fear-based rehearsals with Joe. Here, Quincy encouraged experimentation, respected Michael's strangest ideas, and treated him as an equal. The recording sessions for Off the Wall were an explosion of joyous creativity. For the first time, Michael was in control, contributing his own songs like the blistering opening track, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, a song whose lyrics were a direct reflection of his own relentless, obsessive work ethic. The album was a shimmering, ecstatic fusion of disco, soul, and pop, a body of work that was sophisticated, sensual, and undeniably adult. From the breathless falsetto of Don't Stop to the heartbreaking vulnerability of the ballad She's Out of My Life, where he famously broke down in tears at the end of a take, the album showcased a vocal and emotional range that the public had never heard from him before. It was the sound of a young man stepping out of the shadows and into his own light, a celebration of freedom, nightlife, and romance. Off the Wall was a massive critical and commercial success, selling millions of copies and solidifying his status as a solo star of the first magnitude. But despite its success, a deep wound was inflicted that would fuel the next stage of his ambition. When the 1980 Grammy nominations were announced, Off the Wall, an album universally hailed as a groundbreaking classic, was largely snubbed in the major categories, earning Michael only a single award for Best R&B Vocal Performance. He was devastated. He felt the snub was not just an artistic judgment, but a racial one. The music industry, in his eyes, was still confining him to the box of R&B artist, refusing to see him as a pop visionary on the level of artists like the Bee Gees or Billy Joel. The pain of this rejection was immense. He reportedly wept backstage, but the tears quickly hardened into a diamond-hard resolve. He vowed that his next album would be so undeniable, so colossal, so inescapable that the industry would have no choice but to recognize his genius and bow down. He was no longer just fighting for artistic freedom. He was fighting for respect, a battle against a system that he felt was determined to keep him in his place. This struggle was further amplified by the institutional racism of the burgeoning music video landscape. The new and incredibly influential cable channel, MTV, had a de facto color barrier, overwhelmingly favoring white rock artists. Despite the cinematic quality of his videos for Off the Wall, they were largely ignored. The fight to break down these barriers, to force the industry to acknowledge the artistry and commercial power of black musicians, became a personal crusade. He was no longer just the sweet little kid from Gary. He was becoming a revolutionary, a quiet, soft-spoken warrior armed with a singular talent and a burning, righteous anger. Was this the moment he truly became a man, forging his own path? Or was the obsessive perfectionism that now drove him simply a new, more sophisticated version of the fear his father had drilled into him? A desperate need for an approval that always seemed just out of reach? If Off the Wall was a declaration of independence, then 1982's Thriller was a cultural nuclear event, a sonic and visual shockwave that permanently altered the landscape of popular music and global culture. Fueled by the pain of the Grammy snub and the institutional racism he faced, Michael Jackson reconvened with Quincy Jones with a singular, obsessive mission: to create the biggest, best, and most undeniable album of all time. He poured every ounce of his ambition, his perfectionism, and his visionary genius into the project. He wanted an album where every single song was a killer, a potential hit. The result was a work that transcended genre, race, and language. Thriller was a masterful fusion of pop, rock, funk, and R&B, featuring the blistering rock guitar of Eddie Van Halen on Beat It, the paranoid cinematic funk of Billie Jean, and the charming pop duet with Paul McCartney on The Girl Is Mine. It was an album designed for total world domination, and it succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Thriller went on to become, and remains, the best-selling album of all time, a commercial behemoth that shattered every record in its path. At the 1984 Grammy Awards, he completed his quest for vindication, taking home a record-breaking 8 awards in a single night, a moment of absolute triumph that saw him weeping in the arms of his sisters. But the success of Thriller was about so much more than album sales and awards. It was a visual revolution. Michael Jackson understood, perhaps better than any artist before him, the power of music videos in the new MTV era. He didn't just make promotional clips, he made short films, cinematic events with storylines, high-end production values, and groundbreaking choreography. The video for Billie Jean, with its iconic imagery of him lighting up the pavement with every step, finally shattered MTV's color barrier, forcing them to play the video in heavy rotation due to overwhelming public demand. The Beat It video, with its epic gang dance-off, became a cultural touchstone. And the 14-minute-long Thriller video, directed by John Landis, was a global event, a horror movie musical that changed the game forever. The visual iconography of this era became permanently etched into the collective consciousness. The single glittering white glove, the military-inspired jackets, the signature red leather jacket from the Thriller video. These weren't just fashion choices, they were the costume of a new kind of deity, a figure who seemed to exist on a plane entirely separate from mortal entertainers. He was crowned, officially and unofficially, the king of pop. But this apotheosis, this ascent to a level of fame that no human being had ever experienced before, came at a terrible, irreversible price, profound, soul-crushing alienation. A pivotal, traumatic event occurred in 1984 during the filming of a Pepsi commercial. A pyrotechnic effect misfired, engulfing his head in flames. He suffered second- and third-degree burns to his scalp. The accident was more than a physical injury. It was a symbolic moment where the massive, dangerous machinery of his own fame physically attacked and wounded him. It led to his first serious use of powerful painkillers to manage the excruciating pain, planting the seeds of a lifelong addiction. It also necessitated a series of painful scalp surgeries, marking the beginning of a more dramatic phase in his physical transformation. Like Icarus, he had flown higher than anyone, and the sun of his own stardom had now literally burned him. He became the most famous person on the planet, and therefore the most isolated. The hysteria that surrounded him was terrifying. He could no longer go anywhere or do anything a normal person could. He was a prisoner of his own face, a face that was itself beginning to change through more plastic surgery and the onset of vitiligo, a skin disorder that was met with widespread public skepticism and ridicule. This physical transformation, whether driven by disease, dysmorphia from his father's taunts, or a conscious desire to create a more racially ambiguous, fantasy-like being, only served to deepen his isolation. He was becoming an other, a spectacle, a being that no longer seemed fully human. The deafening roar of adoration from millions of strangers became a wall of sound that blocked out any possibility of genuine human connection. His inner monologue, one can only imagine, must have been one of profound, echoing loneliness amidst the constant noise. He was seen by everyone but truly known by no one. The world had its king, but the man, Michael, was beginning to disappear, fading away behind the armor and the mask of his own creation. The year 1993 marks the definitive, irreversible point of no return in his life story. It was the year the fairy tale shattered into a million irreparable pieces, the moment the world's most beloved entertainer began a terrifying and public transformation, from an eccentric, godlike genius into a potential monster. The tragedy began, as it so often does, not with a bang, but with a whisper that grew into a world-consuming roar. The first allegations of child sexual abuse were made against him by the family of a 13-year-old boy who had been a frequent and welcome guest at Neverland Ranch. What followed was not a quiet, discreet investigation, but a global media firestorm of unprecedented ferocity. The story was a perfect toxic cocktail for the burgeoning 24-hour news cycle and the ravenous, bloodthirsty tabloid press. The world's biggest and strangest star, a reclusive man-child living in a private amusement park, accused of the most heinous and unthinkable crime imaginable. It was a public crucifixion in slow motion. The media, which had once worshipped him as a king, now turned on him with a savage, predatory glee. News helicopters swarmed the skies above Neverland, their long-lensed cameras peering down like vultures, violating the one sanctuary he had built to protect himself from the very world that was now invading it. The most traumatic event of this period, the one that would permanently scar his psyche, was the police raid on his home. Imagine the violation. Dozens of officers, symbols of a harsh, unforgiving reality descending upon this whimsical, magical space he had so meticulously crafted. They weren't just searching for evidence, they were systematically dismantling his soul. Strangers in tactical gear walked past carousels and train stations, past candy stores and cinemas, to enter his most private space, his bedroom. They touched his clothes, opened his drawers, sifted through his personal belongings. They seized his private home videos, his journals filled with his innermost thoughts and drawings, his personal letters, the unfiltered, unguarded fragments of his inner life, and logged them as potential evidence of a monstrous crime. For a man so intensely private, so obsessively in control of his own image and environment, this was a violation of the deepest and most profound kind. It was a physical and psychic invasion that confirmed his deepest fears, that the world was a dangerous, predatory place and that there was nowhere, not even his own bedroom, that he could ever be safe. The psychological damage was immediate and catastrophic. His health deteriorated rapidly. He became gaunt, unable to eat or sleep, his body racked with the stress and terror of the situation. He developed an addiction to painkillers to cope with the immense pressure. He was forced to cancel the remainder of his dangerous world tour and publicly address the allegations in a televised statement from Neverland. His voice trembling, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading pain as he proclaimed his innocence to a world that was already beginning to doubt him. He was subjected to a humiliating and degrading full-body police examination, a procedure that he would later describe as the most dehumanizing experience of his life, a moment that stripped him of the last vestiges of his dignity and his mythic status. His inner world, already a fragile ecosystem of past trauma and present pressure, completely collapsed. The adoring public that had been his lifeblood, his source of validation and love, was now a global jury, and the verdict was far from certain. The paranoia that had always lurked in the shadows of his mind now consumed him entirely. Every camera flash was an attack, every journalist a potential assassin of his character. He was trapped in a waking nightmare from which he could not escape, ultimately facing the prospect of a long, torturous, and incredibly public trial, and on the advice of his legal team who warned that even an acquittal would not erase the permanent stain of the accusations. He made a fateful decision. He agreed to settle the civil case with the accuser's family for an undisclosed but reportedly enormous sum of money. His team maintained vehemently that it was not an admission of guilt, but a pragmatic business decision, a desperate attempt to make the nightmare stop and to avoid years of career-destroying litigation. But in the court of public opinion, the settlement was seen by many as exactly that, a confession, the act of a guilty man buying his freedom. The stain was permanent. The crucifixion was complete. Though he was never charged with a crime in this instance, the myth of Michael Jackson, the magical, innocent Peter Pan, was dead. In its place was a new, far darker figure, a man forever shadowed by a terrible, unanswerable question mark. His art became the only outlet for the volcanic rage and pain that was consuming him. The 1995 album History, Past, Present, and Future, Book 1, was not a pop record. It was a furious, paranoid, and deeply wounded counterattack. A double album, with one disc of greatest hits, The History the World Knew, and a second disc of new material, His Side of the Story. In songs like the blistering duet with his sister Janet, Scream, and the politically charged anthem They Don't Care About Us, he was no longer the universal lover but the wounded warrior lashing out at a system he saw as racist and predatory. The music was a raw, bleeding wound, a public exorcism of his torment. This was art as surgery, a desperate attempt to cut out the poison of betrayal and show it to the world. But it was the sound of a man who would never be the same again. The years following the 1993 allegations marked a profound internal transformation. A strategic retreat from the world into a self-created reality designed to be both a sanctuary and a fortress. The king of pop, once the most visible and accessible man on the planet, became the recluse king, a figure of myth, mockery, and intense speculation who was rarely seen outside the fortified golden gates of his own kingdom. The central symbol of this era was Neverland Ranch. Before the raid, Neverland had been his fantasy playground, a joyous, if eccentric, attempt to rebuild the childhood he never had. But after the raid, after the violation, its function changed. It became his fortress, a beautiful, sprawling 2,700-acre prison designed to keep the dangerous, judgmental adult world out. The whimsical fairy tale facade of the amusement park, the zoo, and the movie theater now masked a state of high-alert paranoia, surrounded by high walls, armed guards, and a sophisticated security system that monitored every inch of the property. It was a bittersweet, tragic dichotomy, a place filled with the laughter of visiting children, but built and maintained by the profound trauma and terror of its owner. His inner world mirrored his outer one. He became more reclusive, more dependent on a small, insular circle of staff and a few trusted friends. The world had proven itself to be a source of immense pain and betrayal, and he responded by trying to create a world of his own, populated only by those who he felt would not judge him, namely children. This, of course, only fueled the public's suspicion and provided endless ammunition for his critics, creating a tragic, self-perpetuating feedback loop. The more the world judged him for his childlike nature and his friendships with children, the more he retreated into that world as a defense mechanism against the pain. It was during this period of intense public scrutiny that he made two of the most public and perplexing moves of his life: his marriages. In 1994, he married Lisa Marie Presley, the daughter of the only man whose fame could be compared to his own, Elvis Presley. Their union was a collision of two American royal families, a spectacle that fascinated and baffled the world. To many, it felt like a strategic, almost bizarre public relations move, a performance of normalcy. For Michael, it seemed to be a desperate attempt to project an image of adult heterosexuality to a world that was now questioning his very nature. He was playing the role of a husband, trying to prove that he was not the monster the media had painted him to be. The marriage was short-lived and intense, a brief, strange chapter that did little to quell the public's skepticism. His second marriage, to his dermatologist nurse, Debbie Rowe, was even more unconventional, but it served a far more profound and personal purpose. It was a direct path to the one thing he craved most in the world, the one role he felt could redeem him: fatherhood. The births of his two children, Prince and Paris, were the central defining joy of this dark period. In becoming a father, he saw a chance for redemption, a chance to create the loving, magical, and safe childhood for his own children that had been stolen from him. He would often speak of experiencing a vicarious childhood through their eyes, of finally getting to do the simple, playful things he had been denied. The image of him shielding his children's faces from the paparazzi with veils and masks, while mocked by the media as another act of bizarre eccentricity, was in reality the act of a man so deeply traumatized by the toxicity of fame that he would go to any lengths to protect his children from its glare. He was a wounded animal, hiding his young in a gilded cave, determined that the world would not steal their innocence as it had so violently stolen his. He was no longer trying to heal the world, as his songs so often proclaimed. He was just trying to build a safe one for his children, a tiny island of innocence in a vast, predatory sea. The new millennium brought no peace for the recluse king. The fragile sanctuary he had built for himself, already violated and tainted by the 1993 allegations, was about to be systematically dismantled before the eyes of the world. In 2003, a new set of child molestation allegations emerged, this time stemming from a highly publicized television documentary that had been intended to rehabilitate his image, but had spectacularly backfired, showcasing his unconventional lifestyle and friendships with children to a skeptical and judgmental public. This time, there would be no civil settlement. The state of California brought criminal charges against him, and the world prepared for what would be billed as the trial of the century. The 2005 trial of Michael Jackson was not just a legal proceeding. It was a global media circus, a grotesque carnival of judgment that played out for months outside a small courthouse in Santa Maria, California. It was the second, more public and far more brutal crucifixion. The media descended like a locust swarm, with thousands of journalists from every corner of the globe setting up a virtual city of satellite trucks and broadcast tents. It was the ultimate reality show, and its star was being tried for his soul. The trial was a systematic, surgical dissection of his private world, the inner sanctum of Neverland, his most personal spaces, his bedroom, his habits, his relationships. All were laid bare, analyzed, and twisted into incriminating evidence for public consumption. But the most enduring and heartbreaking images of this period were of Michael Jackson himself. The king of pop, the electrifying performer who had once commanded stadiums of 100,000 people with a single pelvic thrust, was gone. In his place was a frail, gaunt, almost skeletal figure, a man who looked as fragile as a porcelain doll, his eyes hollowed out with terror and exhaustion. His entrances to the courthouse became a daily spectacle of sorrow. He often appeared late, looking dazed and terrified, his face hidden behind sunglasses as he navigated a gauntlet of screaming reporters and gawking onlookers. One day, in a moment that perfectly and tragically encapsulated his complete physical and mental collapse, he arrived at court late after a medical issue, still dressed in his blue pajama bottoms. It was the ultimate symbol of his humiliation. This was his moonwalk in reverse, a slow, agonizing glide backward into the depths of public degradation. The king, stripped of all his royal armor, his defenses shattered, was now just a broken, terrified man who could barely perform the simple act of getting dressed for the fight of his life. After months of grueling, soul-destroying testimony that picked apart every aspect of his life, the jury delivered its verdict. Not guilty on all counts. It was a complete and total legal exoneration, but it was a hollow, meaningless victory. In the courtroom, there was no cheer of triumph, only the quiet, exhausted sobs of his family. Michael himself showed little emotion, a man so thoroughly brutalized by the process that he was beyond celebration. He had won the legal battle, but he had irrevocably lost the war for public opinion. The damage was done. The trial broke him. He could no longer live in Neverland. Its innocence and his had been irrevocably poisoned. He fled America, becoming a global nomad, a king in self-imposed exile. He drifted between countries, Bahrain, Ireland, Las Vegas, a ghost haunting the luxury suites of hotels, a man without a kingdom, a man without a home. Compounding his emotional devastation was a catastrophic financial ruin. Decades of lavish spending and a lack of new income had left the world's biggest star drowning in a sea of hundreds of millions of dollars of debt. Backed into a corner facing the loss of everything he owned, he was forced to contemplate the one thing he had resisted for years, a return to the stage. This led to the final desperate act of his life, the announcement of the This Is It tour, a planned 50-show residency at London's O2 Arena. It was billed as his glorious return, his final curtain call. In reality, it was a Herculean, almost suicidal attempt to reclaim his legacy and more pragmatically to escape the financial abyss that was about to swallow him whole. As the documentary footage from the rehearsals would later show, the pressure was immense. We see a painfully thin, 50-year-old man battling chronic, debilitating insomnia and a host of physical ailments, pushing his aging body to its absolute limits, trying to recapture the magic of a man half his age. He was a ghost, rehearsing the steps of a life that was no longer his, a final, desperate dance on the edge of a precipice. The final curtain fell not on a stage in London, in a blaze of glory before adoring fans, but in the cold, clinical, and tragic quiet of a rented mansion in Los Angeles. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died from an overdose of the surgical anesthetic propofol, a drug administered to him in his own bed by his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, as a desperate, reckless treatment for his chronic insomnia. The irony was devastatingly cruel. The world's greatest, most electrifying entertainer, a man who had brought joy and energy to billions, died, not in a spectacular fashion, but in an artificial, induced sleep. Because he was so tormented, so anxious, so haunted that he could not find the simple, elemental peace of a natural night's rest. The drug that killed him was a perfect, tragic symbol of the artificial life he was forced to live. A life that required a constant manufactured escape from reality. It was his final moonwalk, a silent glide backward into an eternal dreamless sleep, finally escaping the world that had crowned him and killed him. His death triggered a global outpouring of grief on a scale not seen since the death of Princess Diana. The world mourned the loss of a genius, the loss of the music, the loss of a man who had been the soundtrack to their entire lives. But his death did not resolve the profound conflict of his life. It immortalized it. His legacy is the ultimate cultural schism, a fault line that runs directly through our society, leaving us permanently divided. On one side of this chasm stands the undeniable God-tier musical genius, the innovator who shattered racial barriers on MTV, forcing a new visual language for popular music, the visionary who revolutionized the music video, turning it into a cinematic art form, the breathtaking performer whose art brought unparalleled joy to every corner of the planet, the songwriter of some of the most beloved and unifying songs in human history. This Michael Jackson is a figure of light, of magic, of pure, unadulterated talent. On the other side of the chasm stands the deeply disturbing, tragic, and unresolved narrative of the Accusations. The unsettling friendships with children, the out-of-court settlement, the bizarre lifestyle, the two criminal trials that, despite their verdicts, left a permanent stain. This Michael Jackson is a figure of darkness, of suspicion, a symbol of innocence lost and trust betrayed. A man whose story makes it impossible for many to ever hear his music in the same way again. And so we are left, permanently divided, forced to ask the impossible questions, not just about him, but about ourselves. Do we mourn the genius who gave us Billie Jean or the boy who never had a birthday party? Can you still dance to Thriller without hearing the echoes of his trial? His story is not one of simple guilt or innocence, of black or white. It is a story lived entirely in the gray, a labyrinth of genius and trauma, of adoration and accusation. He was a paradox, a contradiction, a man who sang of healing the world while being unable to heal himself. The final haunting question that lingers long after the music has faded is not simply what he did or didn't do. It's who he was. Was he a monster hiding in plain sight, a master manipulator who used his childlike persona as a shield for unspeakable acts? Or was he the ultimate victim of modern fame, a child who was abused by his father, castrated by celebrity, and crucified by the world, a boy who was never allowed to grow up, and a man who was never ever allowed to be innocent?